Uncovering the most fearless Black American soldiers under Patton's command begins with a map, a clock, and a single terrible shortage: tanks. October 1944. The Allies were grinding through Europe, and General George S. Patton found himself short of armored punch where he needed it most. Waiting idle, trained and ready, was a Black Tank Battalion the Army had kept on the sidelines. Why were these men standing by while the war raged? That question sits at the heart of what follows. They were the 761st Tank Battalion, men who would come to be called the Black Panthers by their own crews and by the press. 2 years of training at Camp Hood hardened them into a unit that would not merely survive the chaos of the European battlefields, but change the way armored warfare was seen, and force a nation to confront the contradiction of fighting tyranny abroad while tolerating segregation at home. If you're watching this, tell us where you're watching from. Camp Hood was an endurance test disguised as instruction. For nearly 24 months, Black recruits drilled in maintenance base and on firing ranges, learned to move in column, to read ground cover, to keep their Shermans alive against a world that, on paper, expected less from them. Training was not abstract, it was survival. Commanders expected mistakes to be costly. In a segregated army where a single failure could be read as a confirmation of racist assumptions, the men of the 761st pushed themselves into a standard beyond mere competence, near perfection. Segregation was woven into their daily routine. Mess halls, buses, and local towns all marked the difference: separate entrances, separate facilities, and the constant quiet humiliation of being treated as less than full soldiers. Those indignities informed discipline. If a white crew could sail past a mined road and live, a Black crew felt the pressure that a mistake would be read as a racial verdict. That pressure made them meticulous at the controls, fastidiously clean with radios and tracks, precise with gunnery. It was not only fear of shells, it was fear of what a misstep would do to every Black man in uniform. Patton came into the scene not as an idealist about race, but as a commander desperate for armor. He was blunt, pragmatic, and in his way, contemptuous of institutional timidity. He recognized an available resource, an experienced tank battalion with men who had begun to think like crews and not as second-class replacements. He did not promise social reform. He did not speak of justice. He needed tanks. He needed fighters he trusted under fire. So the order went out. The 761st would cross the English Channel and enter the fight. Crossing into Europe, the men encountered a landscape that could swallow the unwary. Autumn mud turned fields into a sucking mass that acted like a slow, patient enemy. Sherman engines sucked in cold, gritty air, tracks chewed through farm fences and left the countryside scarred.
Their baptism of fire came quickly. In their first major engagement, in a town referred to in some records and oral accounts, Morville-Levick, ambushes, concealed anti-tank guns, and the precise terror of 88mm artillery awaited them. The battalion's mettle would be tested not in textbook maneuvers, but in improvisation under the most primitive conditions. The sky full of tracer, the ground shaking under each impact, and the crews learning to trust one another beyond any racial division the Army insisted upon. Among the men, several figures come forward as lenses through which to view the battalion's courage. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was one. Quiet by manner, but iron in resolve, Rivers led from the front. When his tank was hit and he was grievously wounded, he refused evacuation. According to accounts retained in unit histories, despite a shattered leg, he continued to command and fight until another round ended him. His death was not an endpoint, but a combustible spark. The loss of Rivers pulled the battalion together. Grief hardened into an almost vengeful efficiency on the battlefield. Decades later, the nation would recognize his sacrifice with its highest honor. For the moment, his comrades carried on. Sergeant Warren G. H. Cressy, recorded in some source notes as Cy Cressy, is another voice in this crucible. Cressy's tank took a direct hit. His crew was stunned, and chaos leaned close. Rather than fold, he adapted, climbing from wreckage, seizing a Jeep-mounted machine gun, and turning himself into a one-man counterattack until reinforcements arrived. These were the kinds of improvisations that defined the 761st, men who could turn defeat into opportunity in the span of a few heartbeats. Combat withstood no romanticizing. Shells ripped apart steel and wood, but it was the small, intimate moments that decided battles. The loader who kept the last round ready, the driver who found a narrow lane through orchards where maps showed none, the gunner who, with a single sighting, stopped an advancing panther. Tanks are loud. Tanks are claustrophobic. Inside their metal shells, crews bonded as brothers. Race, for all the Army's efforts to keep it a categorical divider, dissolved amid the urgency of life and death. That is not to say that every moment removed racial tension. Outside the vehicle, segregation still framed interactions with the military bureaucracy, with civilians, and often with white fellow soldiers. Inside the tank, however, men judged each other by steel and by aim. December 1944 would bring the 761st to a different sort of test. The German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, through forests, snow, and a merciless cold at every unit in its path. Supply lines snarled. The battlefield was a confusion of blown bridges and hidden mines. The 761st moved north in a forced march through a storm that turned the world white.
Visibility dropped to a few yards. Engines coughed and froze. Radios failed more often than they worked. Yet in those conditions, armored units became decisive. Their role in relieving the siege of Bastogne, the storied town encircled by German forces, was not a parade of glory but a grim, necessary stroke of tactics. By striking the German flank and cutting vital roads, the battalion helped break the chokehold on besieged troops. For many infantrymen surrounded in the town, the sight and sound of American tanks rolling through the snow was a moment of salvation. The 761st presence shifted morale as surely as it shifted maps. The men themselves, despite being segregated within their own army and often overlooked by media and command, performed with a determination that age would later recognize as legendary. Spring 1945 brought the siege of the Siegfried Line, the German network of fortifications meant to blunt any Allied advance into the heartland. The 761st pressed through obstacles designed to stop armor, dragon's teeth, concrete bunkers, and prepared anti-tank zones. Their Shermans, judged by some to be inferior to Panther and Tiger tanks in direct gunnery, relied instead on speed, coordination, and audacity. Using combined arms tactics, finding gaps, and sometimes leaping over obstacles that tests of doctrine said were impassable, they poured through German defenses. Prisoners were taken, positions that had long seemed impregnable were forced open. Then, in early May 1945, the battalion crossed into territory that required a different kind of courage. They arrived at a Nazi subcamp associated with the Mauthausen complex. In the transcribed oral histories and unit records, another name appears for a specific subcamp, Gürkersen Lager. Whatever the local spelling, the scene they found was unmistakable. Rows of skeletal figures, emaciated men and women who had survived industrialized cruelty, and the remains of a system designed to strip human dignity away. The 761st soldiers, men who had lived through segregation, through insults, and second-class citizenship, confronted a scale of dehumanization that unmoored even the most hardened. The liberation was not cinematic in a way that movies could tenderly frame. It was a confrontation so raw that men who had trained for mechanical tasks found themselves speechless. They helped carry water. They cut prisoners from barbed wire. They offered coats and cigarettes and whatever small human supplies could be spared. Some of the crewmen could not look away from the faces of survivors without collapsing into a private grief that fused their own stories of humiliation with the suffering they found. In that moment, the battalion's fight against Nazism intersected with a deeper, moral vindication. Their presence there was an affront to the racist ideologies that had declared them lesser.
Even as they witnessed, they did not exploit. The script of liberation is filled with cautionary notes. Do not sensationalize these scenes. Do not trade dignity for spectacle. The men behaved with a reverence that the historical record captures not in flourish, but in small acts. A blanket draped, a handful of bread offered, an embrace that spoke more than any official communique. The cameras and the reports that followed would show images, but for the survivors and the liberators, the memory was more like a wound that would never quite close, a truth that demanded to be told honestly. Victory in Europe did not erase the contradictions the 761s had lived through. They returned to a nation that applauded their flag and not their personhood. Parade? Not for most black veterans. Instead, they faced continued segregation, employment discrimination, and even violent assaults for wearing the uniform. In some towns, men in uniform were refused service. In others, veterans were threatened for asserting the very rights they had fought to defend abroad. The national hypocrisy was stark. Soldiers who had risked life and limb for ideals could still be treated as outsiders at home.
The battalion's performance was eventually recognized, but only after long institutional delays. In 1978, the 761th was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, a formal, overdue acknowledgement of the unit's extraordinary combat record. And in 1997, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. These honors cannot undo the immediate injustices of the 1940s, but they serve as official reckonings that history sometimes exacts, if belatedly. The timeline between service and recognition exposes the slow gears of justice in a nation wrestling with its ideals. Throughout these events, several recurring themes demand attention. First, courage amid contradiction. The 761 fought with a ferocity shaped by the need to be flawless in a system that allowed their mistakes to be politicized. Second, identity forged in metal and mud. The tank crews developed a brotherhood that was not an escape from race, but an assertion of humanity against it. Third, the paradox of recognition. Military valor forced the nation to confront its double standard, but that confrontation was not immediate nor tidy. And finally, moral vindication. The presence of black soldiers liberating camps, taking prisoners, and breaching the German homeland was an emphatic refutation of the racist theories that justified exclusion and segregation. To understand the unit's tactical contributions is to see beyond the myth of lone heroism and into the mechanics of team performance. A tank is a system: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant. Each man's role was essential. The 761 learned to compensate for Shermans that were sometimes outgunned by enemy heavies by leveraging speed and coordinated maneuver.
They practiced shoot-and-scoot techniques, used cover, and worked closely with infantry to reduce vulnerability to concealed anti-tank teams. When a tank went down, crews were trained to quickly recover surviving members and to scavenge parts under fire. These were not improvisations by amateurs. They were disciplined adaptations that made them effective against a capable foe. The human cost cannot be overlooked. Rivers' death is one such cost that the unit paid and mourned. He died in combat, a fact that provoked immediate grief and a long shadow of remembrance. His actions, according to accounts, were emblematic of a leadership style that preferred shared risk to removed authority. When Captain David Williams, his commanding officer, ordered an evacuation for his wounds, Rivers refused, a stubborn decision that reads as both bravery and the tragic calculus of soldiers who want to die with their men rather than be carried away. That decision and its aftermath galvanized the battalion, pushing them to fight with a focus that would win battles but also leave scars. Cressy's story offers another contour. Tanks are vulnerable, and when his was hit, he transformed from crewman to ad hoc infantryman, mounting a light machine gun on a commandeered vehicle and holding ground against counterattacks. These acts of individual initiative, joined to unit discipline, produced tactical results that commanders could count upon. For Patton, who cared most about results, such initiative confirmed a hard calculus. These men were effective fighters who delivered in the most demanding circumstances. The unit's conduct at Bastogne matters for more than a single battle report. That relief operation shifted morale and operational tempo in a sector where everything teetered. The 761st's ability to punch through weather and terrain and to perform in combined operations with other elements, artillery, air recognition when weather permitted, and dismounted infantry, made them a decisive flank force. Stories from the ground include details of convoys slipping along snow-choked roads, of crews shifting into the lead during ambushes, and of infantrymen who would later write letters home about the difference a tank made when it rolled past a foxhole in the morning light. When the battalion breached the Siegfried Line, they did more than cross an engineering barrier. They broke a psychological line. The German defensive apparatus, designed to sap momentum, was a test of nerve. The 761st met that test through coordinated assaults, clever use of terrain, and aggression at the point of contact. Speed, more than direct firepower, often decided the day. Shermans, properly handled, could exploit flanks and rear areas, collapsing defensive networks that the enemy thought secure. The liberation scenes must be handled with care and retelling.
The survivors at the subcamp, whatever the specific local name recorded in transcripted materials, transcript spelling, Geekerson logger, verify, were in a state of physical and mental collapse. The battalion's men were not immune to the moral shock. Accounts describe soldiers who had been hardened by combat, breaking down in quiet corners. They wrote letters home where they struggled to explain what they saw. Photographs taken by contemporaries show gaunt faces and piles of discarded clothes, and make a historian's job both possible and painful. When archival images are integrated into any production, each source must be verified for rights and caption accuracy. Use photographs, film reels, and camp documents carefully and with respect for survivors and their descendants. Returning home, the 761st's men faced a society that remained deeply divided. Stories abound of veterans being refused service for wearing their uniforms, of police harassment, and of the slow path toward civil rights that would not flower fully until decades later. These men had fought in the name of universal ideals. They returned to a nation that had not yet learned to apply them equally. The contrast between battlefield recognition and domestic neglect is raw. It animates much of what would become the longer civil rights struggle, the insistence that service and sacrifice should translate into citizenship in fact, not merely in rhetoric. Official recognition, when it arrived, was halting but meaningful. The Presidential Unit Citation in 1978 recognized the men's extraordinary combat record as a group. Rivers' Medal of Honor in 1997 rectified an individual omission in the record of honors. These acts did not erase the personal losses or the immediate indignities, but they did place the 761st into the public memory in an official way. Museums, historians, and descendants would use these recognitions as entry points to deeper inquiry, to ask how institutional racism had shaped the deployment and treatment of black units, and to understand how heroism can exist even when a nation's values are imperfect. The legacy of the 761st is not a clean moral tale with tidy closure. It is a contested, resonant history that invites both admiration and critique. Admiration for a unit that performed with distinction under the harshest conditions, critique for the nation that asked more of these men than it was prepared to give in return. Their story complicates simple narratives about World War II as the good war, free of the contradictions that plagued American society. To tell this story is to commit to certain responsibilities. First, we must not invent details where records are unclear.
Where names or places appear only in oral transcripts with contested spellings, they should be flagged. For example, the transcript lists Moreville-Levick, transcript spelling Moreville-Levick, verify, as a site of early combat. Local subcamp names appear in transcript notes as Gherkinson Lager and Mounthausen, transcript spelling Gherkinson Lager, verify, transcript spelling Mounthausen, verify. Each of these must be verified against primary sources in any finalized production or publication. Second, liberation scenes must be portrayed with dignity and restraint, avoiding sensationalism while honestly conveying the scale of suffering. Third, do not conflate military service with immediate civil rights gains. The path from service to social equality was long and contested. For production teams assembling visual and audio materials, archival integration is essential to the story's authenticity. Suggested archival elements include training footage and photographs from Camp Hood, images of Sherman tanks and maintenance base, footage or photographs of Patton inspecting units, verify rights, convoy crossings of the English Channel, combat footage from the Ardennes, and liberation photographs from the relevant subcamp, verify provenance and permissions. Audio sources such as oral histories from surviving members or contemporaneous interviews should be used sparingly and credited precisely. Every archival item must undergo rights clearance and factual cross-checking. The 761 story also speaks to modern viewers in ways that matter. It asks us to consider how military institutions reflect societal divisions and how individuals refuse to be defined by the limitations those institutions impose. It invites reflection about the costs of war and the long arc of recognition. The men who served under Patton did not fight for medals alone. They fought because survival, duty, and pride demanded nothing less. Their courage forced a country to reckon, slowly, unevenly, with its professed ideals. As an epilogue, imagine a soldier from that battalion stepping off a transport in 1945, his uniform still dusted with European mud. He returns to a hometown that has not changed enough. He tells his story. Some listen, some do not. Years later, ceremonies will call his battalion courageous, will place ribbons and citations into archive drawers, and will at last name names like Reuben Rivers and others. Those honors matter. They are not omnipotent. They cannot resurrect what was lost. But they do something necessary. They mark memory, they authorize stories, and they demand that subsequent generations learn. Uncovering the most fearless Black American soldiers under Patton's command is more than a recounting of battles and medals. It is an exercise in honest memory, to see men as they were, fierce in combat, dignified in defeat, and stubborn in the face of injustice. Their legacy is both martial and moral.
Against the brutal machinery of Nazism, they fought with skill and courage. Against the slow machinery of American prejudice, they fought with a persistence that would help open doors for those who came after. If you want to dig deeper into the primary sources, oral histories, and unit archives that inform this narrative, we have compiled a resource list linked below. It includes suggested books, declassified unit reports, and survivor testimonies. For production teams, verify all place name spellings and archival rights for footage and photographs, and treat liberation imagery with the highest standards of sensitivity and attribution. Honor their names. Remember their actions. Subscribe for more deep dives into overlooked chapters of military history and the people who shaped them. If this story moved you, share it with someone who should know the truth of these men's courage.